Everyone. Today I'm speaking to Jason Opal, who is a professor at Department of History at McGill University. Hi,
Hi,
Jason.
how are you?
I'm good. I hope you're also doing well. Jason, I wanted to ask you about your view on the latest developments in Ukraine.
Yes, so I think the news of some Russian successes and advance on different parts of the Eastern Front, um, combined with the death of the Russian opposition leader Navalny, has really pushed the situation as it's seen in the United States to a new point. Obviously, the military situation is precarious for Ukraine. The latest figures I heard were that the Ukrainian forces were being outshelled about 5-1 because they don't have enough artillery. And there's obviously pressure on several parts of the front. So there's that. And then the news of Navalny's death, apparently now confirmed, and the circumstances still mysterious, have really made this situation different in the United States, where support for Ukraine was very strong at first. It remains strong in a number of different parts of the society, but it has this increasingly intense opposition among the sort of Trump party, the Trump part of the Republican Party. But I'm not sure right now the situation might change because there's a perception of Ukraine's real weakness, or perception that Russia might actually prevail, which has not been thought to be a possibility in a long time. And the death of Navalny also has underscored the brutality of uh, minimally the brutality of the Russian regime, which I think might galvanize the United States to support Ukraine again.
So, do you think this support will be secured because it's been delayed like for some time, and it's Ukraine is actually losing soldiers, and this is reflected also on the battlefield, right? Ukraine,
Yes.
some say, lost Avdiivka because of that. Yeah, been outnumbered, outgunned. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that for right now, there is strong support for aid, military aid to Ukraine, a very large package, approximately $60 billion US in aid. There's very strong support for that in the US Senate and from President Biden. The issue is in the House of Representatives, where the Republicans have an extremely narrow majority and where the Trump Republicans are very strong, even though the more traditional moderate Republicans want to support Ukraine. My feeling is that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, there will be intense pressure on the House of Representatives to pass some degree of aid to Ukraine. My guess is that a slightly reduced aid package with some strings attached definitely has a chance to pass, because of the real fear in the United States now that Ukraine is in trouble, and that the Putin's regime is really even more aggressive than they had imagined.
And in case, let's say, this aid is secured, in case if during re-elections Trump comes to power, you think that this aid will be cut completely?
I think if Trump returns to power, which is a huge if, it's really, I mean, the political situation in the United States is very, very in flux, and there's very few ways to sort of predict it at the moment. But should Trump return to power, I think aid to Ukraine would be substantially imperiled. I think it would be, I think he would either veto or oppose most or all aid to Ukraine. So I think that would be, an extremely, extremely heavy blow to Ukraine. But that's a long ways off. That's not till the election is until November. Trump wouldn't even assume power until January of 2025. Even if he were to be elected, which I would not at all say is, I would say it's a toss-up at the present moment. But yes, Trump is in that sense the main threat to the United States' continued support of Ukraine.
And do you think that there is a way Ukraine can secure more help from other Western countries like Canada?
Yes, I think so. So I think what will happen is as follows. I think precisely because of the possibility of Trump's return to power, Mr. Biden and the administration currently in the United States will try to get in as much aid as possible, and that aid could include sort of game-changing weapons, similar to we saw in the fall of 2022 when the HIMARS systems really, really transformed the conflict, right? It really enabled Ukraine to destroy Russian forces far from the front. The next big weapon, obviously, aircraft would have been the other one, but the other big weapon that the United States has not yet provided Ukraine with are long-range precision-guided missiles. Those would be, I think, also game-changing. If aid were to be secured, I think what you'd see is the U.S. Accelerating the aid for those kinds of weapons. And yes, I think other NATO partners, including Canada, would increase the funding for and support for Ukraine. I don't see in most other NATO countries, with a few exceptions, a parallel to Trump. So, I mean, you have a couple examples like this, but for example, the Conservative Party in Canada, they're conservatives, but they are, you know, they're just rather traditional in their support of NATO. In fact, they want to increase military spending. So, long story short, the U.S. I think will increase, if it's able to, over the next few months, aid to Ukraine, and Ukraine does have the possibility of more aid from other NATO partners.
And do you think that there is a risk that Ukraine might concede territories this year? Because it seems like, I mean, waiting for aid, and Russia is pushing, and turns out, surprisingly, that those defense lines are only existing on paper, and it's more information resurfacing now that actually there are some defense lines are not even there.
Yes.
So it's basically Russians can just roll over and seize more territories. This is very risky.
Yes, I think there is a real chance for substantial parts of the territories that were freed or cleared of Russian troops in late 2022, the Kharkiv offensive, that those gains might be reversed. I don't think they would be reversed entirely, but that there are real chances for Russian territorial gains over the next couple of months. But Russia can only roll across territory when it has the munitions and gasoline and supplies to do so. And if there are long-range weapons that destroy those munitions dumps, they cannot do so. And the Russian military, while very, very large and in some ways very powerful, also has these enormous weaknesses, which have also been shown. So there's a real risk over the next couple of months of territorial loss, but Ukraine still has a lot of advantages, and I think that aid of the right kind from the United States would really, really make a big difference.
And do you think that, yeah, I see. And do you think those long-range missiles can really stop? Because it seems Russia has now that they have such a high increase in everything, artillery, those drones, and just literally outnumbering in every way Ukraine. They put economy on those military rails. So
yes,
it seems like it's like you cannot catch up and cannot fill this gap. US is not providing aid, so it's really risky. And Ukraine has a shortage of manpower. It seems like it's a very challenging task. Yeah.
It certainly is, and I by no means want to understate the real danger right now for Ukraine, but just like the HIMARS systems really changed things in late 2022, long-range missiles, which are far more accurate and effective than anything the Russians have, the Russians would not be able to defend against them, could cripple logistical systems in Russia or near the occupied parts of Ukraine. And you can have all the men you want. If they're not supplied, they're not effective. So it's not that Ukraine doesn't have a desperate need for artillery shells. It does. It's not that Ukraine doesn't have a desperate need for more soldiers. It does. But long-range munitions of the kind that the United States has and might deliver would change the calculus, and it would make it would reduce the need for Ukraine to try to catch up with Russia's superior numbers and mass of weapons and soldiers.
Yeah, I see. And don't you think that there is also a risk that the Western allies will just push for negotiations, but because it seems like the Ukrainian president is not willing to negotiate at all, it's a fight for survival for Ukraine, and the Russians, they just seems like they are so confident they can take more than they initially planned that they will not stop. Yeah, so it's like really escalatory situation right now.
It's possible that Western NATO countries will both increase their aid to Ukraine or continue their aid to Ukraine, and also begin to put pressure and say, is there some negotiated settlement out of this, which would surely include some cession of territory. I guess I'd just like to underscore, though, I mean, it appears that in early 2022, Putin thought that he could take over all of Ukraine and roll into Kyiv, and he grossly overestimated the power of his military and underestimated Ukraine, even before Ukraine started getting large-scale weapons from the U.S. and other Western powers. So it's a precarious situation, but I do not think it is hopeless. I think it is a question of what are the specific kinds of weapons that the United States, especially, can supply to Ukraine over the next several months. That's the most important factor. And the second most important factor is to what extent will other NATO countries help Ukraine? Those in order to me are the two most important, because there's no question of the determination of the Ukrainians to defend their country.
Sure. And you think there's any other pressure that can be put on Russia? Seems like sanctions don't really work. I was reading about introducing like this Navalny Act, like Magnitsky Act. Maybe that's another way that can punish Russia, you think?
I think the other ways that pressure can be put to bear against Russia without direct confrontation with NATO militaries, which no side wants, so not the Russians, because they're far inferior to NATO militaries. I think the main thing would be to sort of crack down on Russian intelligence operatives and Russian proxies outside of Russia. So assassins in Spain or in the United Kingdom, where they've also carried out attacks in London. For that matter, in Africa, where there are a large number of Russian proxies. I mean, pressure could be brought to bear, all kinds of pressure, financial, even military, outside of Russia. That would be the other thing that could be done, I think, to directly pressure Russia, because a direct military confrontation is just not conceivable. A really big other factor is that there's this news about Russia's efforts to basically put a nuclear weapon in orbit, in space, and to kind of put a new set of pressures directly on the United States. I will say I'm skeptical of these. I mean, there's all kinds of weapon systems that are always in development. Many very, very common for Russia to way overstate its capacities. But this story could really scare Americans in a way that even those Americans who are increasingly reluctant to support Ukraine will support a much stronger line against Russia. So, I mean, this story is just breaking. It's been over the last week. If it gains traction and there's an actual threat that is widely felt in the United States by Russia itself against American airspace, quite literally, or space, you would see a much stronger line against Russia by the United States.
It seems like Russians actually doing quite well in terms of informational warfare, spreading this disinformation.
Yes.
And even in Poland, and they even were involved, some claim, in those protests, blocking the border with Ukraine.
Yes.
So I guess it's very important to counteract this informational warfare strategies, campaigns they use, and it's all across Europe, even in US, right?
Yes. So it's Russian proxies, both actual persons outside of Russia, but also bots and informational warfare. Unclear where that's launched from, probably from inside Russia itself. But those are the places where a stronger line against Russia could be put in place, and I think would be if. Again, it's really a question of, it comes down to how scared do Americans feel. They don't feel, the issue now is that they don't feel worried about Russia itself. And because one of the major political leaders is quite overtly pro-Russian, it deadens the urgency on the side of the United States. But if there's the real concern about a Russian nuclear space program over the United States, I think you'd see a major change in American public opinion and American policy.
I see. And what do you think about this recent reports about the epidemics in the trenches?
So soldiers? Yeah, I mean, there's a long history dating to the First World War and back to the Napoleonic Wars, in which outbreaks of certain kind of diseases of filth, diseases of being proximity to rats, diseases of dirty clothing and lice-ridden clothing can just transform military campaigns. So that's certainly possible. In the past, that was like typhus and leptospirosis. There are these reports of considerable outbreaks of some undeterminate kind of rodent-related fevers among Russians, but also among Ukrainian forces. It's a big if as to how those infections look in the next couple months as the winter ends and the spring begins. It is possible that those could be very significant effects on one side or the other or both. But right now, it's too early to see. It might just be some isolated cases that don't end up becoming a big factor. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And it comes down to the basic hygienic quality of the trenches, or especially the close exposure to rats and mice. That can be very, very dangerous and could result in large numbers of debilitating infections.
Oh, and Jason, and do you have any other information you think it would be relevant to be mentioned?
I would just say that that American politics has always been somewhat unpredictable. It is extremely unpredictable right now. So I would simply end with the idea that it's very hard to forecast what will happen in the United States, but it is equally probable to me that the United States will gain a greater sense of the threat of Putin's Russia and will increase its support for Ukraine as the other possibility, which is a kind of abandonment of Ukraine. I think it's more likely that you're going to find continued support for Ukraine in various ways and maybe increased support for Ukraine as the threat from Russia becomes more and more clear.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for your time.
Of course, my pleasure.